Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Going to talk today about wokeism. Okay, lots of fun to talk about wokeism. Freedom of speech, academic freedom as well, and we're going to throw in some residential schools in there as well. Okay, so our guest today, Frances Widdowson. She's a former MRU professor in Calgary. I say former because she was fired, I think, a couple of years ago here, and she's been labeled as a residential school denier. Some people call her racist. And I mean, she sees things maybe a bit differently than other professors. Okay, the residential schools, were they, genocidal? I don't think she'd see things quite that way. In fact, she thinks there's maybe some positive outcomes from those schools. So does that mean we should just cancel her? Well, a lot of people think that way. We're going to learn a little more about Frances Widdowson today and, where we get some of these ideas from. Okay, so good to have you with us, Professor Widdowson.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. And I should direct people to a website that you're associated with here, wokeacademy.info. Very interesting, very informative for sure. So wokeacademy.info. Can you first of all maybe update us a little bit on your ongoing, conflict with Mount Royal University in Calgary? Recently, an arbitrator ruled that your firing was actually disproportionate. Okay. So, and I think they're going to award you with some sort of a, financial award, I guess, compensation. But they're saying, the arbitrator's saying, you really can't work there anymore. There's too much hostility and so forth. But I understand that you're going to continue to pursue full reinstatement.
That's correct. So there's no reason why I can't return to work at Mount Royal University today, if Mount Royal University is an academic institution and not an institution that has been overtaken by wokeism, which is identity politics that has become totalitarian. Anyway, the arbitrator did find that I was wrongfully terminated, but said that I could not be reinstated because of the friction that existed with a number of Indigenous scholar activists and trans activists, but I don't work with those people at all. So it really has nothing to do with my work. It has to do with the fact that they claim that they feel unsafe just by me existing in the same academic space as them. So this is a ridiculous kind of claim to occur in a university, in an academic university, because they can't accept people challenging the positions that they hold. Anyway, my case is being appealed by my union to the Alberta Labour Relations Board, the lack of reinstatement. I am very upset, however, because there are a couple of other areas of the decision that should be appealed as well. The procedural problems, all the procedural problems that occurred, as well as the discipline for harassment. It's still standing that the claim that I harassed people, which were satirical tweets on social media that were responding to the attempts of about 30 faculty members to mob me and push me out of Mount Royal University. So that should never have been found to be harassment, and that should be appealed as well. So I'm currently working on trying to get those matters appealed.
Hopefully those things will get brought up in a court setting there. So, the whole unsafe terminology, again, if this is coming from professors, and even from students, frankly, it's time we grow up. People will see things differently. They'll say things that maybe hurt our feelings. Grow up and just deal with it and move on. I'm sorry. That's just where I'm at. All right. I recently read an article here from Barbara Kay, wonderful columnist with the National Post, and she had an article here noting that the Frontier Center for Public Policy just released the second edition from Truth Comes Reconciliation. It's a compilation of essays on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, written by scholars of the Indian residential school system. In this case, Rodney Clifton and Mark DeWolf were the editors. You were one of the essayists in this as well, I understand. So, and what really caught my attention here is that I think we've been misinformed. Okay, there it is. Nice. Okay. I mean, Okay, so I understand this TRC report was about 3,500 pages and apparently not indexed. Like, hello? Anyway, so who's going to read through all of that? Of course, well, these guys did, and so they released instead a summary to the mainstream media, and this is what people were given to report on, and so no wonder we're getting very different reports in the media opposed to what's actually in this report. So what they revealed here, my understanding is that there's a lot of positive things that were buried in the TRC report. The report itself actually indicates that there were some good things that came out of the residential school system. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, so there is a section in one of the other volumes, not the summary volume, of positive stories about the residential schools. And Murray Sinclair, in fact, stated I believe it was 2010, that we needed to hear the good stories of the residential schools as well as the obvious problems that existed in the residential schools. So it's not to say that the residential schools were, universally a good thing, that they did no harm, all these kinds of claims. But the one thing that the residential schools did do is they provided an education to Indigenous children who would not have received an education otherwise at that time, because those children lived in remote communities and it just wasn't logistically possible to build schools in those remote communities. So for those children living in those isolated areas, especially when their parents were still partaking of a hunting and gathering lifestyle, it allowed those children to get access to reading, writing, arithmetic, various skills that they would need to be able to participate in modern society. So, and many parents and also leaders at the time often lobbied for residential schools because they thought that this would be the way in which their children would be able to participate in what they called the white man's world, because the economy that existed previously had collapsed and would not provide a future for their children.
Again, often you're called a racist, but you're not saying, there were no evil things, there were no abuses that happened, yes, there were things that happened, but you're saying, let's look at this in a balanced manner and let's be truthful about this. After all, it is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? So
Yes.
it seems that there were a lot of assumptions made and continue to be made. So if I remember right, it's roughly 150,000 students in the Indian residential school system. So I think most of us are under the impression that the vast majority were forced to attend, maybe kidnapped from their homes and so forth. But how many actually went voluntarily?
Well, this is a matter for academic investigation. So this is a highly contested area, but you have many academics who are activist academics who are claiming that 150,000 children were forced to attend. And I believe that was a claim of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This needs to be investigated. But what we do know is that in 1920, the schools did not become mandatory until 1920. So that was when you had to send your children to a residential school if a day school was not available in an Indigenous community. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that many parents actually applied. So we have many, many application forms of parents applying to send their children to residential schools. Even, for example, the parents of Métis children who technically were not supposed to be at residential schools because it was only supposed to be for status Indians. But because often the educational quality was much higher at the residential schools because of the kinds of disciplines and so on that were in place, often parents, to give their children an educational advantage, wanted to send their children to those schools. And third, and this is something that's not well understood either, is that the residential schools often were used as a child welfare stream. So for children who were orphaned, for
Right.
children whose parents were alcoholics, which is a major problem was a major problem in Indigenous communities, neglected by their parents. What would happen is that they would be sent to residential schools because there was no child welfare system that was in place.
So can we say then this would have been a fairly major benefit to the First Nations population? If they were in those situations, then there was help made available, correct?
Exactly. And if that was not available, if those residential schools were not there for those children, they would have suffered terrible deprivation in their communities. And as well, people don't know as well, there's a great piece in C2C Journal. Pizaski, I think his name was, Greg is his first name. Sorry, I mispronounced his name. I know. Anyway, he does a huge long form essay about how the government wanted to actually shut down the residential schools in the 1940s and just turn everything into a day school. But there was, massive outcry because it was, what are we going to do with all these children who there is no other option in their communities? They're living these terrible lives because of the dysfunction that exists in these communities, and the residential schools are where these children can go when those circumstances exist.
Yeah, see, this is information the public needs to hear to get a proper big picture perspective on what happened. So, again, the allegation is that about 6,000 kids died in the residential schools. So how did they die? Again, you hear the allegations that many were murdered or they died of neglect, etc., something like that. But what did they mainly die of? I understand there's a lot of tuberculosis, things like that.
Well, this is an area which is highly contested as well. And I still haven't, this is not an area that I've looked at in depth, but I've seen people discussing it on this research group that I am involved with. And it's my understanding that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was about a little bit less than 500 students who died in the residential school. So
that's a far cry from 6,000. Yeah, okay.
Is a massive inflation. And we hear the 4,000 number as well. And the 4,000 number is the names that appeared on the banner of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, this entity, this corporate entity that's associated with the University of Manitoba. But the thing that people should know about that 4,000 number is it was not children who died at the residential schools. That's part of it. That's I believe the slightly less than 500. It's children who died within a year after they attended the residential school. And sometimes you have children on there or people on there who are not even related to the residential schools, like Helen Betty Osborne is one of the names of a woman who was murdered in, I believe it is the PA, Manitoba.
But that's completely separate from, okay.
And you see this with the Kamloops case as well. So it's claimed, I believe, that 51 children died at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Well, there was an in-depth study done of this by Nina Green and Jacques Rillard, a historian from the University of Montreal. They found, I believe it was over half from the death certificates, didn't die at that residential school at all. They died in hospital. They died in their communities from accidents and so on. But the biggest killer historically of Indigenous children and probably all other children in Canada was tuberculosis. So tuberculosis
it was a serious issue back then, for sure.
But there were many other diseases as well. The Spanish flu is also another major disease.
One of the other accusations, Professor Widdowson, is that residential schools destroyed Indigenous languages and culture. So is this true? And if so, to what degree, was that happening?
Well, this is, there are arguments about this. Yeah. So it's not, there's no blanket kind of statement that can be made about it, because depending upon the school, depending upon the time frame, depending on the area. So there were some attempts to stamp out Indigenous spiritual ceremonies. Some of them were perceived as being very harmful by the missionaries. For example, the Sundance had people hanging from
Right.
hooks, and that was seen as being a major harmful type of ceremony. So
Well, I think
those
even
kinds of
today,
ceremonies.
I think a lot of secular people might agree that that's maybe
What do
not
you
the best
do?
thing
What do
for
you do
kids to
about
be
those
doing.
kinds of things?
Right. Yeah.
The potlatch. But what people don't know about the potlatch is that a number of chiefs in British Columbia actually put pressure on the government to end the potlatch because it was disadvantageous to their less wealthy bands to have to be paying these huge reciprocal, to be having to buy all these reciprocal gifts. So it disadvantaged the more impoverished bands, and
Okay.
there was a movement on behalf of some Indigenous chiefs to have it ended. But then there were dictionaries that were created in Indigenous languages by religious leaders,
Wow.
and many of the syllabic systems that we see today that are celebrated were actually ones that were created by missionaries. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a it's a bit of a mixed bag. As well, much of the prohibition on Indigenous languages, speaking of them, was just so that you could learn English and French more quickly. It was like a philosophy that you see in many immersion
Yeah.
programs today too.
Gotcha.
So it
Gotcha.
wasn't as if children couldn't speak their languages. It's just that they shouldn't be speaking them in the
Right.
educational setting, those sorts of
Gotcha.
things.
Yeah.
So many of those things need to be considered as well. But there
Yeah.
certainly were concerns about many aspects of Indigenous culture because it was believed at the time that this was slowing down their ability to become full participants in Canadian society. That was the
Well,
rationale. And that
again,
we can look at that today and say that was a wrong-headed kind of approach and caused many, many problems. But at the time, that's what it was considered to be.
yeah, we need to understand that the culture was different at that point than it is now. So how can we expect the same results or the same actions we're, considering to be normal today? You go back, 50 years, it wouldn't be considered normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and I think we have to ask ourselves, what was the intent of the government and of the residential school overseers, whether it's priests or teachers, whatever the case might be? Yes, you might get the odd bad apple there that had a really bad intent, but I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of them, including the government, their intent was actually good. They wanted to be helpful. Now, I've done that before. I've meant to help my wife with something. Ended up not being very helpful, and it wasn't so much appreciated because I didn't, my mindset isn't the same as my mom's. I don't, or my wife's. I don't understand everything. What did she want? My intentions were good, but didn't work out so well. So likewise, were their intentions good?
Well, this is it's a spectrum of views on this, even amongst people who are trying to rectify some of the more egregious claims that are being made. I personally wouldn't be as supportive of the good intentions kind of argument as a number of my colleagues would be.
Okay.
Rodney Clifton and Mark DeWolf, of course, worked in the residential schools, and Mark DeWolf's father was a headmaster or one of the heads of a residential school. So I don't have any hands-on experience about what
Mm-hmm.
occurred there. I know that there were many draconian measures, especially in the early years, and there was very, very strict discipline in many of the schools, which was
Mm-hmm.
not understood very well by Indigenous children because Indigenous children in their communities didn't have harsh discipline like you did in, for example, religious boarding school, which is very, very regimented. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of debate that goes on about it. And of course, you had some very, very strict disciplinarians who were very, very
Yeah.
harsh, and what would definitely be considered to be abuse,
Mm-hmm.
physical abuse. And then, of course, you had the problems of sexual abuse, which is not really known what the extent of that was. There also was a lot of student on student sexual abuse as well that occurred in these schools. So I personally would not say there was just this blanket, well-intentioned kind of effort. I
Right.
certainly would argue the intent was not to destroy Indigenous people, which is the argument that is being put forward to claim that the residential schools were genocidal. So
Yeah,
there's a
I have
really
trouble with that because the term genocide, I mean, we immediately think of Nazi Germany, that sort of thing, right?
yes.
The killing fields and, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's not anywhere near the same level of, genocide, if you want to use that term.
Yes, and this is a huge problem now because what happened is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, first of all, it put in the concept of cultural genocide, which
Okay.
is a nonsensical term that no one should even use that. You
Well,
should
what does that
use
mean? Yeah, what
it
does it
means
mean?
assimilation. It means
Okay.
assimilation. So,
Okay.
like instead of saying assimilation, you say cultural genocide. Now, the reason why the TRC used those terms is because it wanted to get the word genocide into the discourse. And once it
So,
did that, then people pulled the word cultural out of there. But of course, cultural genocide is about the extermination, the physical extermination of a group. That's what people think it means. Assimilation, stopping people from speaking their languages, cracking down on spiritual ceremonies. This is a much more contested kind of idea, as I mentioned about the Sundance. Like, should the missionaries have intervened
right.
in ceremonies that were causing huge problems in Indigenous communities? That's a question. Maybe they
Hmm.
shouldn't have. Maybe, but no one would say that's genocidal to
Well, it's
make
such a
that.
pejorative term, right? And I
Yes,
think it's designed to be that way,
it is. It's designed
And
to exaggerate the
yeah,
situation, and that's why Kamloops was the supposed 215
well, let's.
remains that were found. That was to give credence to the idea of physical genocide. And then there's another
Yeah.
matter, which is
Hmm.
forcible transfer. That's why you see the 150,000 forced to attend being constantly being stated, because that gives credence to one of the fifth elements of the Genocide Convention, which is forcible transfer of
Right.
children from
But do
one group.
we, again, the question I think is, do we know this to be true? Yes or no? And so what's happening is now there's pressure, cultural pressure here, that it's not okay to ask questions. So we need to get into this a little bit. So let's touch base on Kamloops here, okay? So,
Yes.
3, 4 years ago, something like that, right? Okay, ground penetrating radar. The BC Indian Band there in Kamloops announced that they've found, well, I think initially they said something like missing children, graves that were there. That this is what it's showing. But this made hysterical headlines around the world. I mean, you had other countries reporting in their major newspapers and on television and so forth that 215, Indigenous kids were murdered, and there's a mass grave. And I'm going like, this is ground penetrating radar, and you find out that it's not that terribly accurate. So how did that happen?
Yes, and this is I just did a talk at Brock University on October 29th, which is on YouTube. I highly recommend people look at that
Mm-hmm.
video because I go over all the evidence that was presented and examine the view as to whether it should be considered to be a hoax or not. That's the question, which some people think it should be considered to be a hoax, other people don't. And I personally, I don't think a hoax is the right word to use for this
Okay.
situation that did happen. There was some attempts to mislead people, but a lot of it's just misremembering that
Okay.
occurred, or confirmation bias. But what occurred is that on May 27th, 2021, so about 3.5 years ago, the Kamloops Band announced in a press release that there had been confirmation, this is what they said, confirmation of the remains of 215 children who were students at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So
Yeah.
that's what the Kamloops Band claimed. And they should be held to account for that.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of attempts to rewrite history now and say that no, they were saying possible grades and so on. They did not. They announced that there was confirmation of remains, which was totally untrue. They probably knew this, or maybe not. It's hard to know, but
Right.
they orchestrated a control over information campaign beginning on May 25th. So there was an orchestrated attempt to control information. Even when it was announced in July 15th, 2021, that's when the ground penetrating radar expert Sarah Bollier said that it was anomalies and targets of interest, not remains, and it was only through excavation that you would know.
Yeah.
The Kamloops Band continued to make announcements about the remains of 215 children being found, even in September, saying that there had been a mass grave.
That's misleading, and there's something very, very wrong about that.
Yes.
I mean, there's some obvious questions that, again, we just didn't do a very good job as, mainstream media reporters out there. Okay, first of all, if you've got 215 murdered kids, you think maybe some of the parents would speak up and say, hey, where are our kids? Didn't hear any of that. Were there witnesses to that many kids? There's got to be some witnesses somewhere. Where are they? There's a long list of questions that we need to ask here. I'm running out of time here. I should mention, though, NDP MP Leah Gazan, of course, her private member's bill wants to outlaw, any of the kind of conversation we're having to ask questions. You can't be, a residential school denier, or there's going to be consequences. So, how do we respond to this and bring about some perspective?
Leah Gazan should be ridiculed. She is an absolute embarrassment as a politician. It is frightening, however, because people are taking her seriously.
Right.
And the Prime Minister just yesterday was entertaining this private member's bill that she is putting forward. If that is allowed to go ahead, democracy is over. It's
a profound way to end it, Bill, I'll tell you what. Frances Widdowson, our guest today, we should probably talk again on this. Check out her website, very informative, wokeacademy.info. All right, so we need to actually have a conversation about this, which we're doing today, and continue this, please, all right, with your friends. Again, you can check out the podcast at wiseup.ca or at app.corcoplus.com. Thanks for watching.